Under the Skin. In 2013, Jonathan Glazer released Under the Skin, a horror film disguised as a minimalist sci-fi experiment. Scarlett Johansson plays an alien wearing human skin, driving a van through Scotland and picking up men off the street. Those moments were shot with hidden cameras, so some of the men on screen weren't actors. They were real strangers talking to Johansson, which makes the film feel half documentary, half nightmare. The setup is simple. She offers a ride, flirts, and invites them inside a strange black space. The men strip, walk forward, and without warning, their bodies sink silently into liquid. There's no gore, no screaming, just a slow disappearance while she walks away untouched. Later, we see one victim suspended in the void, skin stretching apart until he collapses into nothing. It's clinical, detached, and horrifying because the film never explains it. At first, the alien is pure predator. She mimics human behavior and consumes without hesitation, but cracks from when she shows hesitation with one man who has a facial deformity. She lets him go, a choice that suggests something like empathy. After that, her attempt to live closer to humans exposes her own vulnerability. The predator becomes prey, ending in a brutal reminder that she never really belonged in the human world. Under the Skin doesn't hold your hand. It doesn't explain its rules or mythology. Instead, it traps you in the alien's perspective, detached at first, then curious, then terrified. That shift is the horror, the realization that empathy, the very thing that makes us human, is also what leads to her destruction. High Life. Claire Denis released High Life in 2018, a mix of science fiction and body horror that A24 distributed in the US. The film stars Robert Pattinson as Monty, one of several convicts sent to a one-way space mission toward a black hole. The crew isn't there for exploration, they're being used as test subjects, trapped in an experiment that pushes the limits of survival and reproduction. The opening makes the structure clear. Monty is alone on the ship, caring for an infant daughter. The rest of the crew is gone. The story then folds back, showing how the mission unraveled. Julianne Binoche plays Dr. Dibbs, a scientist obsessed with fertility experiments. She controls the crew with drugs, extracting semen samples and forcing artificial insemination while denying them real intimacy. Her role blurs science, obsession, and cruelty, making her as frightening as the vacuum of space outside. The ship itself feels more like a prison than a vessel. Corridors are narrow, lights buzz, and the routines repeat until time seems meaningless. Violence comes not from aliens or outside threats, but from the crew themselves. Fights, assaults, and breakdowns chip away at whatever fragile order remains, until one by one, they're gone. By the end, Monty drifts closer to the black hole with his daughter, the mission's last survivor. The film doesn't explain whether they'll die, escape, or simply disappear into the unknown. Instead, it leaves the image of a father and a child, floating into darkness together. High Life works as horror because it strips away the fantasy of space travel. There are no grand discoveries, just bodies, power struggles, and the emptiness of space pressing in until survival feels meaningless. The Hole in the Ground. Released in 2019 and directed by Lee Cronin, The Hole in the Ground is an Irish horror film that twists the changeling mystery into a modern setting. It follows Sarah, a single mother who moves with her young son Chris to a rural home near a dense forest. Not far from the house is a massive sinkhole, wide and unnerving, that seems to swallow sound and light. Early on, Sarah notices subtle changes in Chris. He eats differently, his temper flares, and he stares at her with an unfamiliar intensity. At first, she doubts herself. The stress of moving, the isolation, and her own troubled past cloud her judgment. But the more time passes, the more convinced she becomes that the boy in her home is not the same son she brought there. The film builds its tension slowly, mixing family drama with folklore unease. Sarah hears stories from a disturbed local woman about children who change overnight, about mothers who swear their kids have been replaced. That paranoia becomes her own, until every glance at Chris feels like a question. Is he still her son, or something else wearing his face? The climax brings Sarah back to the sinkhole, where she descends underground to confront the truth. In the darkness, she finds what looks like her real son, trapped among grotesque crawling figures. Dragging him out, she faces the impossible choice of whether to trust the child in her arms, or the one she left behind. The Hole in the Ground works because it never over-explains. It uses the changeling myth as a frame for a mother's fear, the terror of losing a child not to death, but to transformation, and the possibility that you might not recognize them anymore. The Monster. 2016 brought The Monster, directed by Brian Bertino, the same filmmaker behind The Strangers. This time, he strips the story down to just two characters, a mother and her young daughter driving on a stormy night. Their car breaks down on a deserted road, and soon they realize something is stalking them from the woods. The setup is tense but grounded. Rain pounds against the windshield, the headlights cut through the dark, and every noise outside makes the daughter cling tighter to her seat. When they step out, they discover an animal carcass ripped apart in the road. That's the first real sign that something else is out there. From that point forward, the film is a siege. The mother tries to stay tough, but her strained relationship with her daughter seeps into every exchange. The girl is scared of the monster outside, but she's also scared of being let down by the person who's supposed to protect her. The attacks are sudden, loud, and messy. The creature itself revealed in flashes of wet skin and claws under the failing light. By the final act, the mother realizes she can't save herself, only buy her daughter enough time to escape. She fights the monster head-on, bloodied and desperate, while the daughter runs. It's not a clean victory, it's sacrifice. The film doesn't just deliver a creature in the dark, it doubles as a story about a fractured bond between mother and child, and how survival sometimes means facing both the beast outside and the failures inside the family. The Killing of a Sacred Deer. In 2017, Yorgos Lanthimos released The Killing of a Sacred Deer, a psychological horror that feels both clinical and mythic. Colin Farrell stars as Stephen, a successful heart surgeon who lives with his wife, played by Nicole Kidman, and their 2 children. Into this carefully controlled life comes Martin, a teenage boy whose father once died under Stephen's care. At first, Martin seems awkward but harmless. The longer he stays around, the stranger his influence becomes. Soon, Stephen's children fall mysteriously ill. They lose the ability to walk, then refuse to eat, and doctors can't explain why. Martin confronts Stephen with an ultimatum. To balance the scales for his father's death, Stephen must kill one member of his own family. If he doesn't, they'll all die. It's presented without special effects or gore, just a matter-of-fact curse that takes hold, no questions asked. The film leans into Lanthimos' trademark style. Flat dialogue, stark framing, and an absence of emotional cues. The family speaks in monotone, even as their world collapses. That detachment makes the horror sharper, because it strips away comfort. There's no music swelling to tell you how to feel, only silence and the steady ticking of an impossible choice. The climax is as brutal as it is absurd. Stephen blindfolds himself, spins a rifle, and fires until one of his family is dead. The curse lifts and the survivors leave the house hollow, with Martin watching from a distance. The Killing of a Sacred Deer leaves no comfort in its resolution. It takes a mythic idea of sacrifice and drops it into a suburban home, forcing the audience to sit with a decision that has no good answer. The Blackcoat's Daughter. Directed by Oz Perkins and released in 2015, The Blackcoat's Daughter is a bleak atmospheric horror film that unfolds in 2 timelines at once. It centers on a Catholic boarding school in upstate New York, where winter break leaves only a few students behind. The halls are cold, the staff is absent, and something sinister begins to creep into the silence. One storyline follows Kat, a quiet student played by Kiernan Shipka, who grows increasingly disturbed as the days pass. She begins to hear voices, sees shadowy figures in the boiler room, and eventually succumbs to possession. The other thread introduces Joan, a troubled young woman on the road, played by Emma Roberts. Her past is unclear, but she carries a heaviness that suggests trauma and violence. The film doesn't spell out its connections right away. Instead, it cuts between these characters, letting dread build slowly. When the violence erupts, it's shocking in its bluntness. A stabbing in the snow, blood on the white ground, and the sense that evil isn't flashy, it's methodical. By the end, the 2 storylines converge. Joan is revealed to be Kat years later, having been institutionalized after murdering her classmates under the devil's influence. Her journey back to the school isn't for closure, but for reunion. She longs for the presence that once possessed her. Standing alone in the snow, realizing that connection is gone, she breaks down in sobs that close the film with despair rather than resolution. The Blackcoat's Daughter doesn't rely on jump scares or spectacle. It's horror built on loneliness, the feeling of being abandoned by both people and faith, and the terrifying possibility that evil is the only thing left to hold on to. Enemy. Denis Villeneuve's Enemy came out in 2013, a Canadian-Spanish thriller A24 distributed in the US. It stars Jake Gyllenhaal in a dual role, Adam, a withdrawn history professor, and Anthony, a confident actor who looks exactly like him. When Adam spots Anthony in a movie, he becomes obsessed with finding him, setting off a story that plays like a puzzle box. The first half is deliberately slow. Adam tracks Anthony down, calls him, and eventually meets him face to face. The 2 men are identical, but their personalities clash immediately. Adam is passive, Anthony is aggressive. Their lives start to overlap. Adam drawn to Anthony's partner, Anthony intruding on Adam's relationship, until identity itself begins to blur. Visually, the film is soaked in yellow haze, with Toronto's skyline shot like a concrete maze. The spider imagery runs through it, a giant spider looming over the city in a dream, or a woman's face briefly flashing into a spider's body. Villanova never explains these symbols outright, leaving them open to interpretation as metaphors for control, fear, or repression. The ending is what cements the film's place in horror discussions. Adam walks into a room expecting to see Anthony's partner, only to find a massive spider cowering in the corner. The cut to black offers no explanation, just a jolt of dread that leaves audiences arguing years later. Enemy leaves its mystery intact. It's the kind of story that keeps people debating what it meant, long after the credits roll. Maxxxine. Released in 2024 and directed by Ty West, Maxxxine is the third entry in his trilogy that began with X and Pearl. Where the first two films looked back at rural slashers and technicolor melodrama, this one drops Maxxxine Minx into 1980s Hollywood at the height of the VHS boom. Mia Goth returns as Maxxxine, the sole survivor from X. Now in Los Angeles, she's determined to break into mainstream stardom. Casting calls, neon-lit clubs, and the growing adult video industry from the backdrop, but the past isn't far behind. A serial killer known as the Night Stalker prowls the city, and Maxxxine once again finds herself in danger while chasing the fame she believes she deserves. The style leans heavily into the era. The film is filled with synth-driven music, grainy VHS aesthetics, and references to the paranoia that swept Los Angeles in the mid-80s. At the same time, Ty West keeps the trilogy's DNA intact: violence that arrives suddenly, bodies that pile up around Maxxxine, and a main character who treats survival as just another step towards success. By the end, Maxxxine emerges not just alive, but transformed. Unlike Pearl, who was consumed by her longing for fame, or the doomed group in X, Maxxxine uses the chaos around her to cement her place. She's brutal, uncompromising, and ready to keep moving forward no matter the cost. Maxxxine closes the trilogy by turning its focus away from the farmhouses and small towns of the past, and into the glitter and grime of Hollywood, showing that Maxxine's hunger for the spotlight is as dangerous as any killer stalking her. Men. Directed by Alex Garland and released in 2022, Men begins with Harper, played by Jessie Buckley, renting a countryside manor after the violent death of her husband. The film opens with a flashback to their final moment, his threats of suicide, and his fall from a balcony, a trauma that drives her search for solitude. At first, the setting looks calm. The house is surrounded by apple trees, open fields, and quiet woods. That peace is broken when Harper notices a naked man following her through the forest. Later, he appears in her garden, pressing his face against the glass. When she calls the police, they brush it off. Every man she encounters in the village shares the same face, played by Rory Kinnear. The landlord is overbearing, the vicar twists her grief into guilt, the boy taunts her, and the police officer dismisses her concerns. Each encounter adds a different form of intrusion, and together they trap Harper in a cycle she can't escape. The final act is remembered for its body horror sequence. One figure gives birth to another, and then another, in a chain of grotesque rebirths that continue until Harper's husband reappears, battered and demanding attention. Harper, drained, simply watches him, offering no reaction beyond weariness. Men presents its horror through repetition and surreal imagery. The story strips away explanations and leaves the viewer to sit with Harper's experience, a confrontation with grief, blame, and cycles of male hostility that she cannot outrun. Climax. Gaspar Noé's Climax came out in 2018, inspired by a real case in the 90s where dancers were drugged without their knowledge. The film opens with a rehearsal in a bare building. The group moves with precision, captured in a single long take that feels alive, not staged. For a while, it plays like a celebration, music blasting, bodies in sync, everyone at their peak. After the rehearsal, they gather for drinks. The camera lingers on their conversations, arguments, and small rivalries. Slowly, it becomes obvious that the sangria has been laced with LSD. The atmosphere changes. The camera starts drifting, spinning, and dripping as if the floor itself is slipping away. From that point, structure collapses. One mother locks her son in a side room to keep him safe. The dancers' paranoia turns them against each other. Some lash out violently, others collapse into spasms. The music never cuts, and the red-lit hallways turn the screen into a dizzying nightmare. At one point, the camera flips upside down and just stays there while people scream and thrash. The horror doesn't come from a creature or killer. It comes from watching a group destroy themselves under the pressure of fear, drugs, and isolation. The child in the side room dies accidentally, electrocuted, a moment that cuts through the chaos with real finality. By morning, the building is quiet. Survivors lie scattered on the floor, barely moving, while the rest are gone. There's no resolution, no answers, just exhaustion. Climax traps the audience inside the same spiral as the dancers. No way out until it stops. Beau is afraid. Released in 2023 and directed by Ari Aster, Beau is Afraid stretches horror into a 3-hour odyssey built around paranoia and guilt. Joaquin Phoenix plays Beau, a timid man living in a crumbling apartment where every corner feels unsafe. The street outside are filled with chaos, strangers, fighting, graffiti, and threats on every wall, making Beau's fear of leaving his home feel justified. The story begins when Beau plans to visit his mother, but a chain of misfortunes keeps him from getting there. His keys vanish, his luggage is stolen, and when he tries to step outside, violence seems to close in immediately. Every time he tries to move forward, the film shifts into another setting, each one stranger than the last. He's hit by a car and taken in by a seemingly kind suburban couple, played by Nathan Lane and Amy Ryan. Their home looks safe, but the longer Beau stays, the more their hospitality turns controlling. From there, he wanders into the woods and stumbles upon a traveling theater group, where the film blurs reality and fantasy. Their performance folds into Beau's own life story, as if he's watching the stages of his existence play out in front of him. The final act returns him to his mother's home, but nothing offers clarity. The house is enormous, filled with secrets, including a hidden attic that holds the film's most disturbing image. Beau's father is a gigantic phallic figure looming in the shadows. In the end, Beau stands trial in a surreal courtroom, judged for his failures as a son. His death comes not as a twist, but as an extension of the same guilt that shaped every step of his journey. In the end, Beau is Afraid plays like a nightmare in chapters. Each new setting strips away more of his control, until what's left is a man swallowed by fear and guilt with nowhere left to turn. Death of a Unicorn. Directed by Alex Sharfman and released in 2025, Death of a Unicorn blends horror, fantasy, and dark comedy into one of A24's strangest projects. Paul Rudd stars as Elliot, a father driving with his teenage daughter Ridley, played by Jenna Ortega, to a retreat hosted by his wealthy boss. Along the way, their car collides with something unbelievable, a unicorn. The moment sets the tone. Ridley touches its horn and experiences visions that feel cosmic, while Elliot reacts in panic and kills the animal with a tire iron. They conceal the body and continue to the Leopold's estate, where the weekend is framed as a luxurious gathering for power, art, and influence. Guests hand over their devices at the gate, placing them under the Leopold's control from the start. The story turns from shock to exploitation. Ridley notices the unicorn's healing properties when her skin clears and Elliot's allergies disappear. The Leopolds quickly discover what the animal can do and begin using its horn to make injections. Odell, terminally ill with cancer, sees it as salvation. The family's obsession grows and the retreat shifts into something darker, a hunt for the unicorn's parents, who have arrived to reclaim what was taken. The violence escalates quickly. Scientists and guards are torn apart, while the Leopold's son Shepard abuses the unicorn serum for his own gain. Scenes move from satire to horror as the estate turns into a battleground between greed and nature's revenge. The unicorns aren't symbols of innocence, they're feral, destructive, and protective of their own. The climax is brutal. Elliot is mortally wounded, but revived by the unicorns. Ridley confronts the true cost of what her family has done, and the Leopold's pursuit of eternal power collapses in blood. Death of a Unicorn blends dark comedy, fantasy, and horror while layering in Eat the Rich satire. Some critics found the tone uneven, but its mix of father-daughter drama, grotesque imagery, and mythic violence makes it one of A24's boldest swings in recent years. Life After Beth. 2014 brought Life After Beth, Jeff Bainut's first feature, and it plays the zombie story as an awkward comedy about love and denial. The story begins with Zach, played by Dane DeHaan, devastated after the sudden death of his girlfriend Beth, played by Aubrey Plaza. He grieves with her parents, only to discover days later that Beth has returned, alive, or at least something close to it. At first, Zach treats her return like a miracle. They go on walks, talk about the relationship, and it feels like a second chance. But cracks appear almost instantly. Beth is confused about her own death, her memory skips, and her moods swing violently. The stranger part is that her parents act as if nothing is wrong, clinging to her presence and refusing to acknowledge that something supernatural has happened. As Beth's condition worsens, the film leans further into absurdity. She develops a craving for dirt, drags an oven around strapped to her back, and her temper turns destructive. Zach, torn between love and fear, tries to manage her while realizing that more people in town may be coming back in the same way. What started as personal grief expands into a wider outbreak, with the community struggling to accept or control their undead loved ones. The humor is dark and often awkward, but the undercurrent is sincere. Zach's denial mirrors the way people cling to lost relationships, refusing to let go even when it's obvious the person isn't the same anymore. Aubrey Plaza plays Beth with both comedic timing and menace, shifting between sweetness and sudden violence. By the end, Zack has no choice but to confront what Beth has become. The resolution isn't heroic, it's inevitable. Love can't survive when the person you're holding on to is already gone. Life After Beth sits on the lighter side of A24's horror catalog, but its mix of comedy and tragedy shows how even a zombie story can be used to explore grief and the struggle to move on. Opus. 2025 saw A24 release Opus, the debut feature from Mark Anthony Green. The film follows Ariel Ekton, played by Ayo, a journalist invited to a once-in-a-lifetime event. Alfred Moretti, a reclusive pop star played by John Malkovich, is unveiling a new album after vanishing from the spotlight for nearly 3 decades. The setup is clear from the start. A group of journalists, influencers, and industry figures are escorted to Moretti's remote compound. Phones and devices are confiscated at the gate, cutting them off from the outside world. The environment feels like part luxury retreat, part cult headquarters. Staff members, known as levelists, dress in uniforms, enforce rules, and treat Moretti's presence as sacred. At first, the guests act like they're in an exclusive listening party, but unease grows quickly. People are watched constantly, questions are shut down, and conversations feel staged. Moretti himself is a looming figure, charismatic but unsettling. His long absence, instead of making him sympathetic, fuels the sense that everyone has stepped into something controlled. Tension escalates as disappearances begin. Guests wander off and don't return. The compound's rituals, from group gatherings to private performances, blur the line between art and indoctrination. By the time Ariel begins piecing together what's happening, it's already clear that the event isn't about celebrating music. It's about control, devotion, and how far people will go when they're desperate to stay close to power. The film leans on its atmosphere, striking costumes, stylized lighting, and music written by Nile Rodgers and The Dream. Yet critics noted that for all its visual ambition, the story loses focus. Characters feel underdeveloped, and the danger never builds to a satisfying payoff. Still, Opus fits into A24's slate as a modern cult horror, one that asks what happens when celebrity worship stops looking like fandom and starts looking like submission. Y2K. Released in 2024 and directed by Kyle Mooney, Y2K takes the real fear of the year 2000 computer bug and twists it into a full-blown disaster comedy with horror elements. The film is set on New Year's Eve 1999 and follows a group of teenagers at a suburban house party. What begins as a typical night of drinking, hookups, and teenage awkwardness turns apocalyptic the moment the clock strikes midnight. Instead of minor computer glitches, the so-called Y2K bug triggers chaos on a global scale. Machines revolt, technology malfunctions, and the world outside the party collapses. The teens who are expecting nothing more than drama over crushes and bad beer are suddenly fighting to survive. The film plays heavily on its late 90s setting. The soundtrack is loaded with era-specific hits, the fashion and slang are spot on, and the house party is filled with little details that feel pulled out of a time capsule. Flip phones, bulky computers, and MTV-style energy. What makes it unsettling is the sudden switch. The same tech that defined the era becomes the source of terror once the bug hits. As the night spirals, the group splits. Some keep partying, others panic, and a few try to take control. The truth is, none of them really understand what's happening beyond the house. And that contrast about teenagers trapped in their own drama while the world outside collapses is what drives Y2K. By the end, it shows the chaos of one generation's New Year's Eve turning into the end of everything they know. That wraps up part 2. Out of this set, Climax is the one to check out if you want a film that feels more like an experience than a story. It's chaotic, loud, and impossible to shake. For something more recent and stranger, Death of a Unicorn shows how A24 can take a mythical idea and turn it into something violent and satirical. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to like the video, drop your favorite A24 horror film in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss part 3.